Ta-da! I've made myself a Christmas door wreath using one kind of festive greenery. It's actually the old-fashioned Christmas tree greenery, which I've cut from my sister's garden. I've had loads of compliments about how simple and elegant it looks, but I actually want to add in some eucalyptus and ilex berries, the holly berries, just to add some luxury contrast. But now I've made the wreath, how am I going to fix my extra bits of foliage in? Well, the answer to that, I'm going to use my hot glue gun. I know that sounds crazy, but if, like me, you didn't have all your greenery to hand when you started making your wreath, a hot gun really is your best friend. Now, as well as adding in my eucalyptus and my red berries, I also want to add in some of these long pine cones. Now, if you've been watching my series, which I film live on a Tuesday morning called From My Garden, you'll have seen me wiring up these pine cones, but I'll give you a quick recap. But if you want to watch the extended video, don't forget to check it out, and I'll leave a link to it in the notes underneath this video. I'm going to use these floristry wires. They are a 0.90 floristry wires, and they are about 25 centimetres long. You need to get the ones that are quite long because they're going to have to go round your pine cone and then have enough length left in the prongs to go right the way through your door wreath so you can fix your pine cones firmly in place. And if you'd like to source your own wires, I'll leave a link in the show notes underneath this video. So what you need to do is start about 1/3 of the way down your wire, and then I'm wiring up halfway along my pine cone. These pine cones are so long that I'm going to be lying them flat onto my wreath rather than having them standing out proud like you might do for the more commonly used pine cones. And there are those two little prongs which will help me fix my pine cones in place. I've got my pine cones all wired up. I'm not quite sure how many I'm going to use. I'm still waiting for my hot glue gun to warm up. So in the meantime, let me show you the foliage that I'm going to be using. My classic red berries and the glaucous green of my eucalyptus. Now, don't these look fabulously festive? Now, the other reason that I'm adding in my greenery so late is because sometimes when you set your task of making your fabulous Christmas door wreath, it can become overwhelming thinking you've got to do it all at once, and you sometimes just don't have the time or the energy to do that, and it can put a lot of pressure on you, and you don't want to be doing that, especially at this time of the year when there's so many other things to think about. So I had a lovely day out with my sister gathering the Christmas greenery from our garden. We sat and made our door wreaths together, and my door wreath has looked perfect on my front door with no adornment at all. But I particularly enjoy layering up my Christmas flower arrangements, or any flower arrangement that I do. You decide when you want to stop, when your arrangement or your wreath is finished. So I could say that my Christmas door wreath is finished now, or I could say it's finished when I've added in some of my eucalyptus, or I could say it's finished when I've added in my red berries, and I could say it's finished when I've added my pine cones in, and perhaps even a beautiful velvet ribbon. So don't beat yourself up. If you only get to stage 1 of your door wreath, adding in your Christmas greens, leave it at that and just tell everybody you wanted to go really simple this year. So I have bought this Christmas greenery from our street market in town. I think I paid £12 altogether. I think that may have been £8 for the berries and then £4 for the bunch of eucalyptus. And I've had them sitting in this enamel jug out on my patio table. So even if I didn't get to use them and put them into my Christmas door wreath, they just looked fabulously festive out in the frost and snow on my patio table. Now, one thing I have been trying to do this year is to make a wreath that is fuller than I normally make. My normal making style for my door wreaths is quite small and neat and compact. So this time I have gone for a much bigger door wreath frame. Normally I make my door wreaths when I'm teaching on a 30cm wreath frame, which is 12 inches. And this time I think I've sized up to a 16-inch door wreath. And how many centimetres would that be? About 40 centimetres, I think that is. So I've gone bigger. And also when I cut my greenery, normally I cut it sort of between finger and thumb length long. And I've tried to go a little bit longer this time, again to give a fuller door wreath that is going to look more luxurious on my front door. Now, the way I have made my wreath, I happen to have used one of the raised wreath frames. So this outer edge, the bigger circle, will be the single bit of wire that is rubbing up against my front door. And then the way that the wreath is shaped, it's a little bit like, you know, a volcano shape. So it's volcano shaped rather than bowl shaped. So if you are using these raised wreaths, just make sure you've got it the right way around. Rather unusually for a florist made wreath, I don't use any moss. Now that is all down to personal taste. For me, it's one less job to do. I don't need to go to the florist or the wholesalers to find myself a bag of moss. Traditionally, you would use the moss because it would give you a nice rounded shape, a bit of profile to your wreath, but also it would keep your greenery fresh because of the moss's water retaining qualities. Now, my front door is north facing and I've got a small porch roof over the top, so it's protected from the elements. And I have found over the years that I don't need to use moss, so I totally skip that part out. And actually, one of the ladies who's in my free Facebook group, Flower Start World, there'll be a link to that group in the notes underneath this video, has said that she doesn't like using moss because as it dries out, it starts to scatter, and it's not the scattering of the moss on the doorstep. Of course, when you open your door into your hall, all the moss falls out. Well, not all of it, but you might get a scattering of moss actually on your hall floor, and that can be quite annoying. So what I do is I pack out the base of my wreath with longer stems of greenery. Sometimes I use conifer because I've got lots of conifer in the garden. Just a greenery that isn't expensive, readily available, you can just get on to cover up some of this wire frame. And if you don't do that and you try adding your more decorative materials onto your wreath frame, you'll find, because it's got lots of gaps, that your materials fall through, and also because you have to pull your wires quite firmly to hold your greenery in place, you might actually distort the frame. And if you want more advice on making your Christmas door wreath in that way, I will leave a link to another video and that'll show you exactly what to do. And then once I got the basic green on to cover up the wire frame, I then cut my handfuls of greenery, and I did try to cut them longer than I would do normally, and just worked in going on the same direction. I'm not even sure where I started on this wreath, but I start off with the fronds at the top. If you imagine that's where my fingers are, I then bind over where my wrist is, and then the next placement is putting your fingers over the top. So if that's a bunch of greenery, you bind here, and then you add your next bunch of greenery with the lovely delicate ends of it covering up the binding that would have been on the wrist of your previous bundle of greenery. You just need to get into the flow. So all the time you're just adding your greenery on top, on top, on top. You're not tucking it in underneath. And if you're struggling to do it, it may well be that you're kind of doing it the wrong way around. So I tend to start at the top of my door wreath and then work my way around like that around the edges. I think I'm probably making it more complicated than it needs to be. So what I want to do here is I'm going to take my eucalyptus and measure it up against the length of my fronds of Christmas pine, just to make sure that I'm keeping them, again, quite long. My temptation is always to go small and neat, and I'm trying to break out and do something a little bit different. So instead of just going finger to thumb length, I'm going to stretch that out and probably cut my pieces 10, 12 centimetres long. I'll start off by cutting just one piece and seeing whether I like the length before I cut everything. And I'd rather cut long to start, and I can always trim things to make them shorter. But of course, if you cut too short, you can't add any extra length in. So I reckon for me, a big stretch between finger and thumb. And because I want to get as many placements out as possible, I'm going to cut really close to that side shoot there. And it means that I can get another placement. So I want to get as many placements as I can instead of just cutting out all the little delicate bits at the top. And the time I finish cutting, I will just end up with a stubby twig at the end. So let's just check these for size. Am I happy that that looks at about the right length? And I think it probably does. So I shall get cutting using this as a rough guide. There we are. That's all that I'm left with. And then I'll do the same thing with my red berries. Now I just need to be a little bit careful here, because as I cut them and handle them, the berries might start to ping off. So just very gently cutting right in to the centre. I'm going to get rid of that stumpy bit there and make my way down the stem. And here, I want to extend the length of this little short section. If I cut here on the main stem, it just gives me a little bit of longer length to play with. And all I'm left from that stem is that short piece there. So you can see here I've already started to add some of the eucalyptus in. It's really easy to do. You just take a little bit of glue along the length of the stem, lift up the greenery and slide it in. So I'm going in the same direction all the time, like this. So it looks as if it was put in with the original Christmas pine. So that one went to the inside edge. I'm going to put one towards the middle. And then my next piece. And then my next piece will come out to the side. I always like to think of my wreaths as having three sides, the top and the outer edge, and then that middle edge too, just so it fans out across the whole width of the wreath, so you get that lovely rounded profile. And this is how far I've got so far. So I've used 3 stems of eucalyptus. And those are the stubby bits that I've got left. And I don't think you can tell where I started and where I finished. So you just need to make sure it's evenly distributed and pull off any of those fine fronds of the glue trails that you get. And again, I could stop right here and just tell you that I have made a Christmas tree pine and eucalyptus door wreath and leave it just like that. But wouldn't some great berries be fun? And I will say, the more you add in, the more luxurious your wreath would become. So I love adding dried orange slices with red berries and then the pine cones. And every time you add an extra level, you'll find your door wreath just looks more and more delicious. What I'm going to do now is actually hang my door wreath up, just so I can start to see what the wreath will look like. When you're working flat on the table, sometimes you can get just a distorted view and you think it all looks great, and then you hang it up vertically on your door and you think, oh, actually, I should have tweaked things a little bit. So that's what I'm going to do now. And these over the door hooks are really great because although you can see the tiny bit of silver, the chrome that comes over your door, the hook bit is actually hidden. You just need to flick out some of the greenery just so you can't see it. And if you want any advice on how to hang your door wreath, I have got a video about that. And in fact, I think it's one of my most watched videos. So I'll make sure I leave a link to that in the notes underneath this video. So on with the reds. Now I have got some more eucalyptus actually, and I could really go ultra full with my eucalyptus, but half of me is thinking perhaps I should just keep some of my eucalyptus back and then I can use that in a beautiful table arrangement. So exactly the same thing, a little bit of glue along the bare stem and then going in the same direction, add in the berries. Oh, you can see a flash of red, can't you? You can just see it really brings your wreath alive when you start adding in some contrasting colours. I'm just going to hold my berries in place just for a moment because I'm working vertically. If I take my hand away too soon, they might just sort of bend out of position. Can you hear the berries pinging on the floor? I'm going to collect those up because I'm going to make an ice lantern with all my leftovers, and I'll show you that at the end of the video, so do keep watching. And I think you'll agree that that wreath looks absolutely gorgeous, but I have wired up my pine cones, so I'm going to add those in too. So it's pine cones next, and what I like to do is to push the wires together and then hold onto them as if it was a pencil and feed them through into the wreath. Now, the wires might buckle, and if they buckle, you could try straighten them out, but to be honest, I'd cut them off and wire up again. So just take a little bit of time with this. And I'm going to place my pine cones so they're evenly distributed, and because they are quite a large, impactful item, I'm not going to go randomly around like I did with my greenery and my red berries. I'm going to start off by placing them, you know, at 12 o'clock, 6 o'clock, 3 o'clock and 9 o'clock, just to get those sort of main anchor points in and then fill in around that. And eventually you won't be able to see that I made a very square geometric placement to start with. So here goes, 6 o'clock. So I'm holding the back of the wreath, pushing my wires through, and then I take my hand at the back, and where the wires have separated slightly, I twist them round to lock the pine cone in place, and then I'm bending the pointed ends of the wire back into the body of the wreath, so that when I run my hand around the back of the wreath, I can't feel anything jagged. You don't want anything that's going to scratch at your front door. And because the pine cones are on a wire, you can alter the direction they sit. So I'm not going to place them so they do look upright. I'm just going to have each one of them in a slightly different position, so they sort of rotate naturally around the wreath. So 12 o'clock. Now I seem to have lost one of the wires here. It hasn't come through, so I can only feel one wire. So what I'm going to do is to tuck that back in, and hopefully that will hold everything in place. And the test to do, and what you need to do, if you can't find your second wire to do a twist, is give it a wake, is to give it a shake, a little bit of a waggle. And if it withstands that, it will withstand the movement as your front door opens and closes. You don't want anything falling off your wreath. Those are my 4 pine cones in straight away. These two have ended up quite close together, but I can just rotate them round a little bit to separate them out. And then where I see a gap, I will add in my other pine cones, just so they look natural, not overly planned, but I just know that they're evenly distributed. And sometimes when you try and go random, the best way of going random is actually to go quite placed. So I've ended up with a gap here, and I'll show you up close how I'm going to fix that final pine cone in. So I want my last pine cone to sit between these two. So I pinch hold of the wires in order that they don't buckle and that I don't lose one of the wires, quite close to the edge. And then pierce it through the wreath. And then if I turn that over, can you see those two wires there? So I twist them together to lock in place. And then it's these two sticky out wires I don't want on the underside. So I make a little sort of U-bend and push them back into the body of the wreath. That's one done. And then the other one here, bent back and pushed back into the wreath. And there we have a very classy look, if I do say so myself. What I love about Christmas stories, they look fabulous on your front door, but just how lovely would that be as a table centrepiece with a huge pillar candle here, perhaps even inside a hurricane jar. Do you see what I mean? It just gets bigger and more impressive with every layer of material I add in. And if I had some dried oranges, yes, I'd probably add those in too. But one thing I do need to add onto my wreath is a ribbon hook. That is my preferred way of hanging my wreath, just because it's the best fit for my front door, which has a narrow glass panel in it. So I'm limited in the position in which I can add the nail to hang my wreath from. I'll probably use some of the ribbon as well, just to do a very modest bow and leave some tails hanging down below. And that seems to be the fashion at the moment, for either hand-dyed silk ribbons, quite narrow ones, or the lovely narrow velvet ribbons. So you can have whatever ribbon you like, but I would say I think probably the wire-edged ribbons have gone slightly out of fashion, and it's a more natural, organic look. You imagine the tails of the ribbon just wafting around in the breeze. This is the ribbon that I'm going to use. I bought it online, and again I'll leave a link to it in the show notes underneath the video. So I know I need to have quite a long section here for my hook at the top, and then I'm going to make a bow with tails, and I'll fix that in place with wires at the bottom. And for this, I've got my fabric scissors, a nice sharp blade, and these scissors are used for fabric and fabric only. So to make the bow, I'm going to make 2 loops, tie a knot. So the fashion really is for modest looking bows rather than big flouncy ones with lots and lots of loops. So you just need to twist and turn until you get it exactly how you want it. So it's a little bit of pulling tight and then pulling on the tails, just so that everything looks to be in proportion. And then decide how long you want those tails to be. I'm going to go quite long. I've probably got 30 centimetres there, so I shall cut the other one to a similar length, but not exactly the same length. I'm going to go there and then up a bit, I think. I'm going to cut the ribbon at an angle, which will help stop it fraying, but also add a tiny decorative touch. And then to fix it in place, I'm going to turn the ribbon over. So I've got my tufty bits of velvet at the top here. Turn the ribbon over and then slide my wire through that little knot area, like that, halfway along, and then bend the wire back and pinch it together as tightly as I can, like cross over there, hold on with my finger, and then twist the bow round, and then it'll be firmly held in place. And that's given me a little stalk on legs, and then I can add that to my wreath using exactly the same technique as I did for my pine cones. finding those 2 wires at the end, twist them round and bury the wire back into the wreath. So as my front door isn't massively attractive, I'm going to hang this up on my shed door, and then you'll be able to see what my finished wreath looks like. And here we go. How does that look? So what do you reckon? I am rather pleased with the way that's worked out. So just a little bit of a modern touch to it with the narrow velvet ribbons, just catching the breeze a little bit. And then with my added greenery, giving a contrast to the traditional Christmas pine, and then my European style looking pine cones, the longer ones. We get so used, don't we, to using the more squat pine cones. So it's just nice to change things up a little bit. If I ever do get around to drying some oranges, of course, I could always add those in. And wouldn't it look lovely? Perhaps just groups of 2 or 3 together all the way around the edge would add another luxury touch. So I do hope you've enjoyed this video and perhaps learnt a thing or two, or perhaps I've given you a confidence to embellish your own Christmas door wreath. And if wiring isn't your thing, do have a go with your hot glue gun. It really is quite freeing. You just need to make sure everything's really secure and give it the old waggle test. I'd love it if you gave this video a like, leave me a comment, and do share it with a like-minded friend who might need help with their festive door wreath this year. That's all from me for now, and I'll see you again next time. Now, I'll just go and put this on my front door and wait for the round of applause from all my neighbours. I nearly forgot. I said I was going to show you how to make an ice lantern. So I have got this large Pyrex bowl. I can't tip it up. And I have put my advent candle in the middle because I want this to look wreath shape when it's frozen. And I've been putting in all my leftovers and making a little bit of a layer. So I've done 1 layer at the bottom, a 2nd layer, and it's not quite frozen through at the moment. I'm relying on the coldness outside because I never have enough room in my freezer for this kind of thing. So I'm adding some more water in. And then with all those little bits and pieces I had left, the little ilex berries, which were pinging off as I was gluing them in, I'm sprinkling all those in. And when it's totally frozen, what I'll do is to put the whole bowl into a washing up bowl with warm water in it, just so it'll melt the outer edge of the ice, and then I should be able to remove that centerpiece. You can see here it is partly frozen at the moment. And then I will put a tea light in the middle and enjoy that ice lantern outside of my patio until it melts. So what else can I find to put in here? A few more eucalyptus sprigs, I think. And I've also got some Christmas tree trimmings left. I can't decide if I'm going to turn it out and put it upside down or leave some of these bits pointing upwards. We'll have to wait and see. It's a good way of tidying up, really, getting rid of all these bits and pieces which would have ended up on the compost heap.